Part 2. The encampment of the Tong tribe was situated across the muddy floor of a wide valley. Jagged mountains loomed over the expanse, great spires of rock, like the broken teeth of a fallen god. Great mounds dotted the jumbled confusion of the mountains, constantly gurgling with the hot volcanic mud that would ooze down the slopes and add to the mire of the valley. A vast array of grasses and shrubs thrived upon the mineral rich mud. Through trees found Though trees found it impossible to drive roots into the porous mush, it was not the most hospitable environment for men either, and the savage yurts were built on stilts of mammoth bone to keep them well above the quagmire. The mammoths gorged themselves upon the abundant grasses, and their muscles were improved by the daily exertion of lumbering through the morass. The only predators that menaced the valley were the black condors that nested in the mountains. But, while large enough to carry off a full grown man in their talons, they were too small to threaten the mammoths. The encampment was alive with the smells and noises when Dorgo at last emerged from the hide walled yurt of Ungen, the tribe's doctor. The scarred old healer had tended to the hunter's arm, rubbing a pasty unguent into the wound after cutting away the stump of the ivory shard with a rude knife. Dorgo's arm was wrapped tightly in a binding of zaga skin soaked in mammoth urine. The witch doctor had warned him to make the prayers to Onagal to placate the pestilential god, lest his injury become infected despite the healer's precautions. He also advised making an offering to Great Chen, that the Lord of Fate might oppose any ill sending from the King of Flies. Dorgo climbed down from the witch doctor's dwelling, sloshing into the muddy ground. His wound tended, he had to see another of his tribesmen before he could rest. He had been summoned to a meeting with his father to explain to the Khan what had befallen his fellow hunters and their mammoth. A feeling of shame rose within him as he recalled the ease of which the Mohawk had ambushed them, tinged with guilt as he considered the reason Locke had ordered the attack. More than that, he was afraid as he recalled the strange warrior who had butchered his way through the Mohawk and cut the head from the Czar's shoulder. The memory brought a quickness into Dorgo's step. He was not sure why, but he felt a terrible foreboding as he recalled the sinister warrior, a sense of lurking menace that would not relent. A new danger had emerged into the domain, something clothed in the shape of a man, something that was powerful enough to butcher its way through a score of Mohawk killers, and still have strength enough to slaughter Locke as though the chieftain were a feeble old graybeard. If the stranger stayed in the crumbling hills, or contented himself with killing the Mohawk, that would be one thing, but Dorgo could not shake the feeling that it would not remain in the crumbling hills for long. As he walked down the path, which writhed its way between the raised yurts, Dorgo felt his mood darken. He watched the young boys practicing with their throwing spears, the blunted weapons springing back from targets of mammoth skin, stretched tight across ivory frames. He saw little girls weaving baskets from marsh reeds, or carefully mending fur vestments with bone needles and sinewy thread. The grown women, their cheeks scarred with the marks of their households, were gathered together on the massive wooden platform where the old mammoths were slaughtered after their time was past. A great old cow mammoth, her tusks curled back upon themselves until they resembled the horns of a ram, had finally been killed by Quotagir, the wiry mammoth master who tended the beasts upon which the tribe depended so greatly. The women were busy carving steaks from the cow's flanks, while others carefully cleaned the animal's thick skin, readying it for tanning. In one of the sweltering smoke huts that stood either end of the encampment, Kotagir with several of his burly assistants, were carrying the carcass of several antelope to the rocky ground where the mammoths had their pen. The animals would be butchered and ground into minuscule portions, then mixed with the pebbly feed the savage used to supplement the mammoth's diet of grass and roots. The beasts would not touch feed that had been mixed with the flesh of their own, but they accepted meat of antelope and elk readily enough. The meat helped sharpen the minds of the brutes and increase their aggression in battle, or at least so Kotagir's forefathers had taught him. Next to the Khan and the Yorul, the high shaman, Kotagir was the most important man of the tribe, and even the brashest warrior was careful to show him respect. Beyond the pens, in the place of honor closest to the great mammoths, stood the Khan's yurt, its walls of hide daubed with the marks of the savage households he commanded, its ivory supports festooned with dangling trophies taken from the tribe in hunt and in battle. Dorgo saw the iron helms of Van warriors, the sharp horns of Beastkin, the ragged tatters of hung banners, even the immense clubs of Mohawk marauders, and, in place of honor, the petrified head of a basilisk. The trophies were a display for the benefit of the warriors who waited upon their chief, a reminder that there had always been great warriors among the savage, a humbling lesson for men grown arrogant in their own accomplishments. The humbling display was not lost upon Dorgo. As he climbed the ladder up the platform of his father's hut, he looked at the prayer flags waving in the wind above the ivory crown of the yurt, one for each of the hunters who had been killed by the Mohawk. Normally, the bodies would have been left for the condors, the great messengers of Chen, to bear up into the afterworld. But they still lay far away in the crumbling hills. Instead, Yorul had painted their names upon large prayer flags, that the birds might see them as they flew above the valley and inform the mighty Chen of the lost souls that would seek entrance into the realm of the gods. His rescuers in the prowling lands had questioned Dorgo carefully, making certain that he had indeed seen his comrades killed. It was no small thing to paint the mark of a living man upon a prayer flag. Chen might seek out his soul and tear it from his living body while he still lived, if the god felt he had been deceived. The floor of the yurt was covered with furs, hides of bear, saber tusk, warring with those of yeti and tiger for space. The walls were clothed in murals painted upon the skins of zagas, each painting representing some great event from the time of their ancestors. Dorgo felt his eyes drawn to the ancient mural that showed Teocte, the king, uniting the tribes of the domain into his mighty horde. A little pride found its way into the warrior's heart. Despite his fears and shame, the 8 tribes of the domain all claimed to be the heirs of Teocte's power, but only the savage were his true sons. They were of the Tong, the same great people that had unleashed Teocte upon the world, and the same blood as that of the king flowed through their veins. Theirs was the true legacy, besides which the claim of Hung, Kurgan, and Gore were nothing more than envious jests. "Approach, shamed one!" a voice called from the gloom of the chamber, crushing the small ember of pride that had started to show upon Dorgo's face. The warrior turned at the sound of the voice, turned to face the throne of Hutka Khan, chief of all the savage, lord of the war mammoths, wielder of the iron moon, Hutka Khan, his father. The savage chieftain was a massively, powerfully built man. Despite his many years, streaks of iron stained the black sprawl of his beard, and wrinkles burrowed across his face from the corners of his frost-colored eyes. The Khan's hair was shaved into a trio of woven braids that fell well past his broad shoulders. Nodules of steel peppered Hutka's skin like metal fungi, pushing up from within the flesh. Some among the tribe said the growths were the curse of a Sul sorcerer whose wicked knife had injured Hutka in his youth. Others held that it was a mark of favor of the gods, There was a lesson in the whispered stories, Dorgo felt. With the dark gods, it was difficult to tell blessing from curse. Hutka gestured with a steel hand, motioning for his son to approach. Dorgo stepped towards the throne-like seat of ivory and fur, bowing before his chieftain. Hutka stirred within the mass of mammoth hide that swaddled him, shifting from a slumped, comfortable posture to one of dominance and command. The warrior felt a twinge of sympathy for his father. Because of the metal growths, Hutka found it hard to keep warm, the heat of his body draining out of him with the steel nodules. Indeed, he was surprised not to find several of the chieftain's wives squirming around him, trying to warm his clammy flesh. Instead of the nimble, savage girls, Dorgo found his father's throne flanked by grim-faced men. Togmal, the Khan's champion, and the greatest warrior of the tribe, stood at Hutka's left, his crescent-bladed G cradled in his brawny arms. The champion stood a head taller than Dorgo, his beard plaited in elaborate rings, his cheeks deeply scarred with the tally of his deeds. Togmal's forehead was pitted with bony stubble, like the crazed field of fledgling horns. Another, the capricious mark of the gods. Beside Togmal stood Ulagan, the wiry hunter who had led the party that found Dorgo in the prowling lands. He was dwarfed by the hulking warrior, like a fox beside a wolf. Ulagan's scalp was shaved bare, even his top knot cut away. He was in mourning for his wife, who had been claimed by the gods, while giving him a son the previous spring. The hunter had been deeply devoted to the woman, one of Togmal's daughters, and showed no hint of growing out of his sorrow. The flabby, worm-like tentacle that served as Ulagan's arm was coiled tightly around an amulet he wore around his neck, a lock of the dead woman's hair. The hunter's other arm, was noticeably jarring after the spectacle of the opposite, gripping the ivory length of an iron-tipped spear. To the right of the throne, crouched against the arm of the Khan's seat, was the withered shape of Yorul, the shaman's scrawny body nearly hidden beneath his leathery robe and cowl of mammoth hide. A pinched face with sharp, fang-like teeth grinned from the shadow of the hood, gray whiskers sprouting in unsightly patches from the wrinkled folds that had consumed the left of his face. A little ivory rod was pressed between the folds, struggling to keep them from flopping over Yorul's left eye. The eyes of the shaman were mismatched, one the color of amber, the other the pit of jade fire. Yorul's expression, such as the right half of his face could muster, was grave and sullen. "This one," Hutka boomed, voice growling, his thick hand pointing to Ulagan. "He tells me you returned from the crumbling hills." The chieftain's statement brought color to Ulagan's face, and the hunter could not meet Dorgo's gaze. "You were attacked by Muhak," he says. "You were attacked by Zarlok. This dog says all the hunters with you, even the Warmath, were killed by Lok and his cringing jackals." Dorgo felt each word that like a lash against his skin, the scorn of his father's voice a fiery welt against his dignity. As each word cut him, he felt his anger grow, hands clenched into fists. He glared back into Hutka's contemptuous eyes. "I cannot help what Ulagan has told you, any more than I can help if you will not listen to the truth when you hear it." He spat. The warrior's tone brought venom into Hutka's eyes. Hutka's muscles tensed, his face quivering with restrained rage. A moment passed as the thin veneer of control was swept away. Hutka lunged to his feet, spilling the heavy hide on the floor. He thrust his finger at Dorgo as though he were a blade. "It is enough that my son shows himself a coward," the Hutka roared. "That he is a liar as well is more shame than I can accept."